Thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders. Hello and welcome to Start the Week. Today we're all about reimagining. One way or another, all of my guests have gone back into history to turn something old into something very new. Henrik Ibsen's play Ghosts is not that old. It was written in 1881. But for his new production at the Almeida, Richard Eyre says he had to work hard to square the circle of being close to what Ibsen intended while seeming spontaneous to an audience of today. Spontaneous or not, this brief, morbid tale still has the capacity to take the audience by the throat. There's a very different kind of reimagining in Red Dock, the latest work by the Canadian writer Anne Carson. In Greek mythology, the winged monster Geryon only has a bit part in the 10th labour of Hercules, but for Carson that's been enough to inspire not just one poetic novel, but now a remarkable sequel. And the notion of a hidden Celtic map of Europe, fashioned by druids, also takes a bit of imagining, but Graham Robbs insists he's not making it up, and his ancient paths prove that the Celts were a lot cleverer than we might think. But first, a modern retelling of Ramayana from Daljit Nagra. Now, Daljit, it's one of the great Hindu epics that's told and retold. It's several thousand years old, and it's not just an Indian story. I mean, it's spread and mutated across Asia.
Yeah, I think it's probably 2,000 to 3,000 years old. Nobody really knows when it was first actually written, and it was probably an oral story first, and maybe via merchants from south of India went to, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and on to Malaysia and Philippines, and via the north it probably went to places like Tibet and across that vast belt up there. So it's been a big story for many countries for a long time. For example, it's from the 14th to the 18th century in Thailand. That was the main story, and the first city was named Ayodhya after the main city in Ramayana, and the first king was called King Rama. So there are major influences beyond India, as I discovered.
Well, can you just remind people? I mean, people might have heard of Rama and know bits of the story, but I mean, it is in a sense quite an old-fashioned story of good versus evil. But the basic plot line is quite simple.
The basic plot line, which is very simple and basic, a bit like the Aeneid, I guess, is Rama, grows up, is a kind of warrior, marries Sita, the wonderful, beautiful Sita, and he's, the golden couple. But then Rama is exiled because of one of his three mums. And he goes into a forest, and whilst him and Sita are in the forest, Sita is abducted by the demon Ravana, and Rama has to go into battle to win her back. Simple story. But then obviously there's
quite a lot of twists and turns, and monkey armies and
I didn't mention the bears and the monkeys, but there's a few of them. There. I
mean, what was brilliant, even just from the first page in your version, is you've obviously had a brilliant time with the language. I mean, it's bish-boshing, gurgling with collie wobbles, or it feels very now, but you're also reaching back. It feels of its time as well. It's sort of the non-stop laughs of sordid boom shakalaka, shonky conduct, indeed, in terms of Vishnu well-wishers. I mean, did you enjoy that? Is that something that comes through in the older versions?
Well, a lot of the versions I've read were prose versions, and they're very, very straight and serious and present this as a very solemn exercise in moral conduct. I didn't really feel that was the story I imagined, because for most people who know Ramayana, it is an oral story, and it's, there's a puppet tradition. There are kind of great performances of it around India. There's a Ram Leela, which is a 10-day performance of it, and it, it's performed all over.
Diwali is also
Diwali, yeah. So Ram and Sita is the homecoming. Which is the Diwali. And I guess underneath it, for me, with my two poetry collections into this, for me, I'm really excited about exploring language and finding diversity in language. I want to almost feel that kind of that breeze that must have brushed across Shakespeare's cheeks and said to him, look for a newness in language, it's a new world. Because every time I go online, I think, I'm hearing lots of different types of English there. When I walk out my house in northwest London, I'm hearing many different types of English. I'm exposed to those. So I guess we're going to hear Beowulf later on, Heaney, and think of Heaney
or... this week.
Yeah, Heaney or Hughes. That for them, the default was the Anglo-Saxon language. I think for me, it's the global English, and also we can go into things like Hobson Jobson, the glossary, the Empire glossary of the English that's used there. and I found, a few words that were pertinent to my background and pertinent to the story. I mean, there's like Ulu belong. Ulu is spelled in the Victorian dictionary OOLOO. It felt like I was hit by a giant, dinosaur egg. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
Ulu
the
belong.
spell check really doesn't like oolong belong.
No, it doesn't. But my version does. And it's an empire word, and it was used in Malaysia originally. From what I can tell.
And that's actually your name for this wonderful character, the baddie's brother, the Kumbhakarna. And you have around him this wonderful food imagery. You should have spies chewing on every word of your foe. Of you guard your ground, how can power go plump belly up? War is the final fatal morsel to be chewed on by noble kings when all arguments are famished. I mean, it's a completely over-the-top character.
Yeah, I mean... In some versions, he seems really one-dimensional. He's this jolly giant. He's there to fight on behalf of Ravana. But actually, he's quite complicated.
On behalf of Ravana.
He eats his enemies.
He eats
monkeys and bears. But actually, he's quite an intelligent guy, and he says things in a kind of slightly witty, jokey way to his brother because he loves his brother, and he's prepared to die for him. I found that a really moving episode. And also, I don't think it's a very one-dimensional story because when we think of someone like Ravana or Rama... when I started reading around the tradition of it, and in South India, Ravana is seen as a hero. He's a modern-day hero. And in the north, Ravana is presented as a demon. It's black and white. But I mean, part of that is because the south is Dravidian and the north is Aryan. And for many southerners, there's this conflict that the north oppresses the south. So Rama and his hierarchical, monarchical... structure is a kind of imposition not to be endured, Stephanie.
And I think you'll respond to it, reading it now from modern culture. I mean, it sort of would tell you something about the culture you're reading it from, the way you react. I'm not sure if we should reveal, but there's Sita, the wife, is not necessarily treated brilliantly towards the end, and I think people might react to that in different ways depending on where they come from. I mean, you're born in Britain. You're a secular global writer. I mean, was it particularly important for you, or did this story actually seem less significant to you or more?
I grew up with it. I'm from a Sikh background, and some of the Ramayana is in the Adi Granth, the Holy Sikh book, and the 10th Guru wrote his own version based on Valmiki, the northern version, and he was writing his version at a time when the Sikhs were oppressed by the Mughals. So in a sense, his was a clarion call to Sikhs to rise up against the Ravana, which would have been the Mughals. So I've kind of known the oral version of the story as a child. And then coming to it as an adult, reading the Narayan version, which is a kind of one of these Penguin classics, and then reading more and more of them, I suddenly realised this is a really important story for me. It's about my life, my background. And when I was writing, I was always aware of my parents, the way they would side with certain characters and certain values. And in a sense, the story explores my background for me, the Indian background I come from, because it's about honour, it's about pride, it's about notions of justice, which are probably very different to the way we think about those ideals, those three in particular, in the West. And even the treatment of Sita, I know my parents would think of it differently to maybe many Westerners would, and they would actually side with Rama's conduct. And even in my version, so because I knew Rama's historically in the various different traditions being presented in different ways, I want to try and show his flaws as well. So hopefully they come through. I mean,
and Carson, we're going to talk to you in a moment about your book, which is in a sense also sits somewhere between prose and poetry. But I'm interested in how you reacted to this. I mean, you have it's packed full of metaphor, your writing, but it's quite precise, quite sparing. I mean, the exuberance of this retelling, how did you respond to it?
I think it was kind of like bouncing through a playground to me. It had all these explosive places, mostly, maybe not mostly, but I was looking particularly at the verbs, because in translating I always find the hardest part is the verb, because it has this sort of package of energy of the thought in it. And I was wondering if you keep lists of verbs in your house somewhere and go over your first draft and try to put in a punchier verb that bring it to life.
That's a really good question, because as a poet, you know how we work. Yeah. There is an element of that, hoarding these words. And also, partly because I'm always kind of keen to move out of the OED wherever I can, and move off standard English wherever I can.
You've done that.
I think you can safely say you've done that. If they would live normal plus on Earth, a tip-top team plotting against ever-toughening Ravana. I mean, it's the sort of tip-top team I really like. But
the thing with those lists is I have tons of them stashed around my house. They're fantastic lists. I never find a way to work the verbs in. I mean, they're wonderful in themselves, but they never fit the context.
Perhaps you should exchange verbs.
Can I
exchange a whole set of lists, maybe?
And what do you do with adjectives? Do you have a rubbish bin for that? I mean, I do, because...
With what?
Adjectives.
Oh, adjectives are a pain, total pain. Yeah. But I
think it was Mallarmé who discovered that if you've written a longish passage of prose, if you just go back through and remove all the adjectives, to be vastly improved.
My grandmother used to say, just take out all the verys, and also take out the sentence that you were most proud of, that you'd spent the longest time crafting.
It doesn't work.
I mean, Richard Eyre, I'm interested, what was your reaction to this retelling?
I thought it had extraordinary energy. What interested me was it's so unlike English storytelling. For a start, most English storytelling, verse storytelling, is done in the iambic pentameter. That's in the DNA of our dramatic speech. And these lines are very, very long, aren't they? I don't know how many syllables you have in a line, but it certainly seems like 3 times as many as the average line of English dramatic verse. Mm-hmm. And it was sustained. It's like sort of bouncing ball, and I love the use of the Hobson Jobson words and this kind of mixture of all languages that are acceptable in English. So it had a terrific vigour and a kind of foreignness at the same time as being quite accessible.
Graham Robbs.
Well, I was wondering about your as a poet, you have a particular voice, or you find a voice or several voices, and in a way, what you're doing here is allowing yourself to become a conduit for other voices. But is that what you're doing? I mean, are you still writing as yourself?
That's a difficult question. I think for me, with this, I felt I was going through the mist of time, trying to retrace different versions and really serving the characters and serving the voice that came through in the end, the narrator's voice, which felt kind of buoyant and constant oscillation between, spoken normal English forms and just always veering off. So it felt very important to constantly remind the reader that this isn't a standard English project, and I'm actually trying to go through the mists of time to arrive somewhere which has no end point, which is probably just going to bring me back to the present, because the Ramayan's ongoing.
But you're creating something which has never existed in the past, because I guess in the past people have not been able to so easily go from the Thai version to the Southern Indian version to the Northern Indian version. I mean, that was one thing you were pulling together all these different versions to craft something very different.
Yeah, I mean, the tradition of Ramayana is people observe one particular line of translation and are very faithful to that. So North Indians follow the North Indian one, East Indians follow the East Indian, and the Southerners follow the Camden version. That sort of. So there are these various traditions. I don't live in India, and I don't live in South-East. I was born in Britain. So for me, it felt important to move away from that very simple oral version I heard and just propel myself into the Far East and just see what came up. And sometimes I just end up rearranging lots of information from different... So that my prologue, it doesn't actually exist as a prologue, but I took various bits from different versions and then made that prologue, or the ending I sort of rearranged on the back of various other impulses in other stories.
Well, it is like nothing else. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning there's a retelling of a very different sort in Anne Carson's Red Doc. I mean, it's so different. and from anything else, really, it's a struggle to describe it. I mean, I was going to say, it's an updating of the story of the mythical red-winged monster, Geryon, who's killed by Heracles, who you did also write about in your previous book, Autobiography of Red. But really, you've created... I think anyone listening will get the wrong impression from that, because you've created something unique here. I mean, the Greek story has been left quite far behind.
Yeah, I wasn't really interested in the Greek story, frankly. Funny you should mention adjectives. The reason I started to write Autobiography of Red, which is the sort of beginning of the narrative of these characters, is that that legend is contained in some lyric fragments from the 7th century BC by Stesichorus, and he was the poet who freed adjectives from epic rigidity, because adjectives in epic are all fixed epithets. You don't change them. The earth is always black, blood is always down-flowing, and so on. And Stesichorus had the notion, why don't we just make these little places of free invention? And I was trying to translate his adjectives in his fragments and found that all the life of the adjective was falling through the cracks of the translation. The translation couldn't get it, so I wrote the novel in order to catch the stuff that fell out of the adjectives. So the story happened to be there in legend, but not really a storyteller, actually.
Well, that's why I was interested, because you've said, I read something, you'd said stories don't tumble out of your imagination.
No, I have to dredge them.
But that's why. But some people would read this and say, "Well, why did you need this superficial link with the classics? Why go back to the classics rather than just write a story fresh?"
Well, it wasn't superficial. That's the thing. It was the essence. The story is what's superficial. I mean, stories all are. They're just a way of finding something to say while you want to talk, and we all want to talk.
I was hoping, just to give people more of a sense of this, I was hoping you would read a passage. It's Geryon, who in this second book, this latest book, is now called G, in flight. If you could just read us a bit of it.
Why birds have no arms. If you are human, you fly with arms straight out in front and horizontal to the ground, to give least resistance. Of course it's exhausting. Don't fight it, just do it, says G to his arms. He visualizes little pistons all over, pumping him forward. And this helps for a while, but the ache is spreading from his spine in every direction. Down the ice fault pours a steady, cold channel of headwind against him. He knows he is slowing, and probably looks ridiculous. Am I turning into one of those old guys in a ponytail and wings, he thinks sadly. Something skims his cheek.
There's a sense there of where the classic connection sort of comes back. You also have him going swimming and wondering whether people will admire his majestic red-winged breaststroke.
Yeah, I got interested in this book and even more in the other one in thinking what it would be like to just live as a person with wings. It was particularly hard when he went to kindergarten, where other children noticed. But by this point in his life, he's more or less got used to manipulating the wings.
You can't see the page if you're listening, but the text of the book, Red Doc, is in a sort of 2-inch column down the page. Was that something that you consciously decided to do? I gather it wasn't. It was rather accidental.
I wish I could say it was conscious. No, I was messing around on the computer with the format features, and one day the whole text shrank to this column, and it looked so great, I just left it. But then, interestingly, I had to rewrite the text, because having those units of meaning on the page in that little channel made the rhythms work differently, and it found its own proper rhythm. Also, I was able to succeed in my original project of writing a whole novel with only one comma.
I was going to ask you about that. Was that just, you were just testing yourself?
Exactly. And the reader, you didn't notice.
That is true. Although you do notice there's a lot of references to Proust throughout the book. And of course he was quite sort of famous for long sentences, but actually also quite sparse use of commas. Didn't use commas the way
not the way English does, not the way many of his translators do. That's true.
Richard Eyre, I think you're already a fan of.
I am a fan. I think Anne is a true poet in the sense that she makes the unfamiliar seem real and the real seem fabulous. And I think, to me, she reads like a playwright. This, to me, I opened the book, and I thought, oh, I see, this is a play, because a lot of writers don't use commas, they don't use colons, semicolons, they just use dots and slashes. And so I thought, oh, I know, this is telling me how I should read. I understand the rhythms. This is narrative. This is to be spoken out loud. And I actually started to read. I didn't get all the way through out loud, and it's full of the most glorious kind of observations, as well as a sense of what real art is always about, is how do you live your life.
I love there's just this constant metaphors, the rain unloading on the roof and squandering down the gutters, a wrecking, rattling, bewildering, Keith-knuckling mob of rain, a rain with no instructions. I love the idea of that. But that comes after the character Gerion has found himself at his mother's deathbed, and I have to say that feels like the heart of the book, but also something very different. I mean, you capture the excruciating nakedness of that kind of moment in your life.
I think the mother was the only character that continued to interest me after I finished Autobiography of Red. She seemed to be still alive sort of after writing that. And I wanted to write another book only about her, but didn't work out exactly. But she surfaced at the end there.
Because you went through lots of versions. I mean, there's 11 years between this book and the
I was trying to write it for a long time, and it had a play version, it had an actual screenplay version, it had a total verse version, a total prose version, and they were all completely horrible. and then the computer did this channel in the middle of the page and became clear.
So I suspect that's happened to everyone, but we don't usually channel it so creatively that suddenly the computer has done something completely bewildering to our text.
You have to trust John Cage more and go with that impulse.
Change the form.
Chance operation.
I just want to ask about we were talking about 11 years since the last one, but in between, I think you wrote Glass and God, as before, wasn't it? And I've noticed, going back to adjectives, the paralysed. I remember in Glass and God, the daughter goes back home and stays with mum after she's going through a divorce, and it's a difficult relationship, and she's in this small dark kitchen, looks out, and the moor is paralysed with ice. And here Gerion talks about, he looks out and sees a sea, and it's paralysed with a black sheen. That word, because it's partly about the external agencies and what's going on in ourselves. There doesn't seem to be any symbiosis or positive relationship.
I think it's about being brought up in Canada. A lot of paralysed with ice out there. I hadn't noticed that overlap.
It's just because you use it really well, I think. It's pretty unusual use of language.
That's interesting. It's probably a Freudian matter.
And we should say also it's a very joyful book. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's a very funny book to read too.
Oh, thank you.
And and what really interests me, the character of Heracles, who's suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, which isn't terribly funny. But what really interested me was the way you seem to have recreated the Celtic Heracles, who's quite different from the Greek Heracles. He's an old man with the sun-baked face of a sailor because he drives a sun chariot across the sky.
Yes.
And he's a victim of his power to some extent. But in a lot of ways, he's a sad old figure, just like your Heracles. But since the story itself didn't interest you, that perhaps just happened by chance too?
I should say that Graham Robbs is someone who started thinking about the Celts and now can't stop thinking about the Celts. In the sense that your book is all about seeing the Celts everywhere, so we should...
and their Heraclean aspect.
Yes.
But I think the funny thing about Greek myths is that everyone's ageless, or they're all sort of paralyzed, we might say, at their peak in life. And things happen to them which are obviously appropriate to other ages, but they don't seem to have other ages. But you're right that in this story he's old. And I think in Euripides, Heracles, he's old. Or at least he's shattered in a way that he isn't otherwise.
We're going to take another narrative leap here into a different kind of retelling, coming to you, Richard Eyre, who has adapted and directed Ibsen's Ghosts at the Almeida. I mean, there are a lot of well-established translations of Ghosts, Michael Mayer and others. Why did you feel the need to do your own? You had a literal translation, but you were also going back to the original Norwegian.
Well, it's interesting that you call Michael Mayer's version a translation and mine an adaptation.
Accidental.
Well, it's true. Michael Mayer spoke very good Norwegian. I don't speak a word of Norwegian. And we're all... Translation is an extraordinarily vexed issue. We're all familiar with, from reading English translations of menus in foreign cities, how difficult it is to just translate the simplest thing. As my favourite example is in Addis Ababa. There was spaghetti alla puttanesca, which was translated as spaghetti ... bitch. And that's the kind of problem that you're faced every single line and word of a translation. I mean, I work from a literal translation done by a Norwegian expert. And of course, she has already made choices, and I have to examine those choices. I look at the original, and it's I can see what the cadences are, I can see the length of lines, and I also know that Ibsen was very, very worried by the English translation. He felt Ghosts was misrepresenting.
The title was the biggest challenge.
Yes,
of
he
all.
felt that the Norwegian word, and forgive me Norwegians for the pronunciation, but it's gjengangere, meaning a thing that walks again. Ghosts summons up ideas of a spectre, whereas the things that walk again are dead ideas, dead customs, dead habits, the kind of orthodoxies, social and religious orthodoxies that repress society. That's what he's writing about, amongst other things, including euthanasia and syphilis and so on and so on. The brilliance of the play is it manages to, within a space of an hour and a half, condense all these very, very complicated ideas into characterization. And this is... Plays have to live in the present tense. I mean, there's a wonderful description that Anne has of the difference between poetry. Prose is like a house. Poetry is like a man in flames running through the house. And plays, I think, are a man and a woman standing inside the house, talking in a number of different characters. Well, the first thing you've got to do, you take the literal, and everyone seems to talk in the same way. So you have to characterize, you have to take leaps of the imagination that are intuited from what you imagine to be the author's intentions. And there's a massive room for mistakes. There's a massive spectrum of choice, and the choices that I make cumulatively add up to my adaptation, my voice, which I hope is closely married to Ibsen's voice.
I mean, you mentioned the sort of broader version of Ghosts, and of course there's quite a lot of haunting in a lot of Ibsen's play, but the main character does spell out, in a sense, what she's haunted by, that it isn't just people, but past ideas and bad ideas, past events that she can't escape. And it's literally the sins of the father that are being revisited on the son in this play. When it first came out, people were shocked by the reference to syphilis. I mean,
yes.
It's a brutal play.
Well, as it were, and it was criticised for being unscientific, because, of course, syphilis isn't passed on directly from father to son. It's passed on via the mother. And Ibsen, of course, knew that. And what he's implying, but couldn't spell out, is that the mother is aware, once she realises that the son is suffering from syphilis, aware that she's been the carrier. So it has a sort of mythic quality, in the sense that myths are things that recur in society in many different shapes and forms, and the myths within that she seeks to subvert, the main character of the play, are myths that seek to strangle freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of emotion.
I mean, in a sense, there is a connection with some of the other things we've been talking about, myths, the myths that live on in the heart of our culture. I mean, the excruciating thing about Ibsen is it's completely he doesn't dress it up. You know, these big universal themes. We haven't got sort of the monkey warriors from the Ramayana, but it's all played out just in a single front room. It's completely stripped down.
Yes, it's almost in real time. So, I mean, it is Anne's image of the house. It is within a single house, and there's a fire that happens beyond the house, and the fire is clearly a metaphorical fire which burns all the old order and the old ideas. But it's a very, very complicated play about the self-realisation of the central character, who has to abandon the lies that she has indulged in for years and years, and she's indulged in the lies in order to protect her son, and then she realises that, in fact, she's done a massive disservice to him.
And she ultimately has to take responsibility for that rather than blaming it on society. I mean, Anne, do you get the sense of this, I mean, the haunting that comes through in Ibsen? How does that play for you?
I was wondering if you toyed at any point with leaving the title in that literal version.
I did, but I thought that we have a terrific marketing problem.
Yeah,
I mean,
know.
marketing is all people
That's
talk
always
about now in the theatre, but it's revenance, or the French is revenant, is a sort of... again, walkers would be... it's not great. So, but I did think seriously about it.
Those TV shows call it the undead, don't they?
The undead,
But
yes.
that has another connotation.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that's part of the problem with Ghosts, is it has more of this ghoulish connotation,
It does.
which is not
Halloween
what this is.
kind of thing.
It's very hard because it's been performed so many times in this country. It has a theatre history that if I'd called it, a thing that walks again, or walking again, people say, "Oh, you've taken Ibsen's play. You're completely distorting it. I'm a vampire."
Yeah,
But all translators are vampires.
Graham.
that's true.
So in some sense, it's almost the opposite of the original production, because instead of moral outrage, maybe you will arouse moral outrage, but there's also a sense of reverence to a classic play.
I think that's true, except the thing about the theatre is it does exist in the present tense. So you are thinking from second to second and responding from second to second without sort of referring either backwards or forwards. And so in that sense, you're simply responding to the issues, the problems, the personalities of the people who are living in front of you at that moment.
But it's interesting because you do have a balance. You've not updated it when you're watching it. It doesn't feel updated, but you have given it a language that will speak to a contemporary audience.
I have tried to make it seem spontaneous, like these people are thinking of the words as they, as in the present tense. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a line where Ibsen has, "It's a rebellious spirit which demands happiness here in life." That's the literal translation, which I've translated as "we don't have the right to expect happiness." And you get that, in one, boom, it's like being struck by a fist.
Well, it is a sort of wonderful winding path that we're walking with Start the Week today. But I think Graham, Robb will be glad that we're ending up with the Celts, which
Very straight path,
well, in a sense, I mean, the book you've written, The Ancient Paths, Discovering the Lost Map of Celtic Europe. It reads a bit like a detective novel, but with sort of echoes of Name of the Rose or the Da Vinci Code, hidden meanings, roads covering thousands of miles, following the line of the summer solstice. I mean, you do say at the start you're worried that serious people will think you've gone a bit mad.
Well, my agent did when I told her about it, and it was a rather embarrassing idea because it reminded me of all that mystic muddled sphere of druids anachronistically processing around Stonehenge. So for the first year I just tried to disprove it, because the more thrilling an idea is, the more you want it to be true. And the only way to guard against that effect is to look for evidence to the contrary. And I was quite prepared to find out that there never had been a continent-wide system of solar paths devised by the Druids according to very precise but simple mathematical ratios. And I failed to disprove it. It still took a very long time to write it. But I was, in some ways, I'm the odd one out here, because I'm not trying to bring a contemporary voice to the Druids. I'm also trying to show that some things have become strange and remote beyond comprehension.
You should say very briefly, I mean, there is a connection back to Heracles,
yes,
but you started out trying to trace the Heraclean way in
Yes,
Europe.
I wanted to cycle as far as possible along the Heraclean way, which is the path Heracles or Hercules is supposed to have taken on his way through Gaul. And this was after he'd stolen Geryone's cattle. He led them across Iberia, over the Pyrenees, and in fact a lot of the sites associated with Hercules in myth are identifiable on the ground. For example, the pass that he created through the Alps, this is how he broke into Italy. He was a god, so he didn't, mountain is a paltry obstacle. So he created the pass, which is now called Mont Genève, by blasting his way through the rock. And to cut a very long story short,
it
I
is
realised
quite a
there
long
were
story.
parallel Heraclean lines passing through Gaul, because the Gauls also adopted the myth of Hercules. He was the founding father of the Celts.
But I guess what comes through, and you are very painstaking in going through the details. But in a sense, it's just you end up in a place where you're just full of more admiration for the Celts. That maybe the Romans have got rather too much credit for things that had originally been seen and created by the Celts, but they weren't. They didn't leave enough mementos behind for people to give them the credit.
Yes. Well, it's easy to forget that the Celts had marched into Rome in 387 BC and sacked it. So they were always the barbarians to the north to be feared. And when they turned up in northern Italy in the 4th century BC, the Romans had been terribly impressed by their technology and their high-speed chariots and roads, which Celts built before Romans. And they adopted the whole technology, which is why most of the Latin words for wheeled vehicles were originally Celtic. And we know that the Druids had a 20-year-long education, which was given to boys and girls, rich and poor. We know that they knew a lot about Greek mathematics and science. They certainly had the technology to create these paths. And actually you can see it in, if you just go to the British Museum and look at almost any object, it could just be a bucket handle. You can deduce the precise ratios that were used to create those objects. So even though this occurred on a continental scale, it also worked on a microcosmic scale.
We've been talking almost all throughout the programme. We've been talking about language and translation and going back and finding stories from fragments. I mean, part of the problem for the Celts is that they didn't really leave written material. I mean, the sort of best you can find is, pretty girl, give me some beer on fragments of pottery.
It's one of the few complete sentences of ancient continental Celtic. And actually that's interesting itself, because it shows that even relatively uneducated people were literate and were able to write using Greek characters. If you want your civilization to last, you have to build it in stone and carve stone monuments, and the Celts didn't do that. They recorded their knowledge in verse. So it was just recorded in brain tissue, which doesn't last, although some of the Celtic myths did last a very long time and are historically accurate.
Daljit, briefly.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned the word roots. You talk about druid and maybe vid, I guess, and being linked to vidir of Latin, being linked to Vedas of the Sanskrit. or meaning to see, to learn, I guess. Are there other kind of roots that we have which link us back to the Celts now in terms of language?
Continental Celtic does have, there are a lot of Indo-European roots that it has in common with some of the languages you were dealing with. And one of the odd things about Celtic civilization is that it did stretch for such a long way. Forms of Celtic were a kind of lingua franca over much of Western Europe for most of the late Iron Age, and extending into Britain. And possibly at one point it was even more extensive than Latin.
And because also you mentioned that the Celts probably started in the Bronze Age. So is it even difficult to specify who the Celts were exactly when they
it's quite
the earth?
Subjective, really, because there's no Celtic DNA. The idea that the Celts were a race was a Roman idea. They were a barbarian, inferior race. And one thing I noticed when I was working on the book is that early on someone said, "Oh, well, you have dark hair and your parents are Scottish, so that's perfect. You're a Celt." And my wife said this to a German friend, and he pointed to a mutual friend who was a very tall, blonde, blue-eyed Bavarian. Said, "No, he's a typical Celt." And since then, I've heard about a Spanish woman who has red hair and freckles, and she's thought to be a Celt in Spain. So it was a culture, not an ethnic group. And the great example is Ireland, which wasn't noticeably settled or invaded in the Celtic period, and yet much of Ireland became Celtic in its religion and language and art.
And you're not worried that you have started to see coincidence and the Celts working through everything? I mean, there's quite a long list of things that you think they're responsible for: crop rotation, land management, education, as you mentioned, precision instruments.
Oh, that's quite well established archaeological fact, actually. The coincidences were more. I mean, just to give one example, at some point I had a.
We're going to lose the example. I'm so
okay.
sorry. I shouldn't. It's terrible to ask you a question and with very little time.
I
think we can say. It turns out the Romans are the first recorded instance of someone reinventing the wheel. It turns out it was actually the Celts. Thank you to all my guests. Richard Eyre's production of Ghosts is at the Almeida Theatre until the 23rd of November. Anne Carson's Red Doc is out now. And Anne will be giving the Poetry Society annual lecture tonight in Liverpool at the university's Victoria Gallery and Museum. And Daljit Nagra's Ramayana, a retelling, and Graham Robb's The Ancient Past, Discovering the Lost Map of Celtic Europe, are both published in October. I'll be back in a few weeks, but next week, What Did the Victorians Ever Do for Us? With Anne McElvoy. Thanks and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Thank you. There's a few of them. There.
I mean, what was brilliant, even just from the first page in your version, is you've obviously had a brilliant time with the language. I mean, it's bish-boshing, gurgling with collie wobbles, or it feels very now, but you're also reaching back. It feels of its time as well. It's sort of the non-stop laughs of sordid boom shakalaka, shonky conduct. Indeed, in terms of Vishnu well-wishers. I mean, did you enjoy that? Is that something that comes through in the older versions?
Well, a lot of the versions I've read were prose versions, and they're very, very straight and serious and present this as a very solemn exercise in moral conduct. I didn't really feel that was the story I imagined, because for most people who know Ramayana, it is an oral story, and it's, there's a puppet tradition. There are kind of great performances of it around India. There's a Ram Leela, which is a 10-day performance of it, and it's performed all over.
Diwali is also
Diwali, yeah. So Ram and Sita is the homecoming. Which is the Diwali. And I guess underneath it, for me, with my two poetry collections into this, for me, I'm really excited about exploring language and finding diversity in language. I want to almost feel that kind of that breeze that must have brushed across Shakespeare's cheeks and said to him, look for a newness in language, it's a new world. Because every time I go online, I think, I'm hearing lots of different types of English there. When I walk out my house in northwest London, I'm hearing many different types of English. I'm exposed to those. So I guess we're going to hear Beowulf later on, Heaney, and think of Heaney
the book
or
of the week this week.
Yeah, Heaney or Hughes. That for them, the default was the Anglo-Saxon language. I think for me, it's the global English, and And also we can go into things like Hobson Jobson, the glossary, the Empire glossary of the English that's used there. And I found, a few words that were pertinent to my background and pertinent to the story. I mean, there's like Ulu Belong. And Ulu is spelled in the Victorian Dictionary OOLOO. It felt like I was hit by a giant, dinosaur egg. It's fantastic.
Yeah, the spell check really doesn't like oolong belong.
No, it doesn't. But my version does. And it's an empire word, and it was used in Malaysia originally. From what I can tell.
And that's actually your name for this wonderful character, the baddie's brother, the Kumbhakarna. And you have around him this wonderful food imagery. You should have spies chewing on every word of your foe. Of you guard your ground, how can power go plump belly up? War is the final fatal morsel to be chewed on by noble kings when all arguments are famished. I mean, it's a completely over-the-top character.
Yeah, I mean... In some versions, he seems really one-dimensional. He's this jolly giant. He's there to fight on behalf of Ravana. But actually, he's quite complex.
On behalf of Ravana.
He eats his enemies.
He
eats
enemies.
Monkeys and bears. But actually, he's quite an intelligent guy, and he says things in a kind of... Yeah, I think it's probably 2,000 to 3,000 years old. Nobody really knows when it was first actually written, and it was probably an oral story first, and maybe via merchants from south of India went to Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and on to Malaysia and Philippines, and by the north it probably went to places like Tibet and across that vast belt up there. So it's been a big story for many countries for a long time. For example, it's from the 14th to the 18th century in Thailand. That was the main story, and the first city was named Ayodhya after the main city in Ramayana, and the first king was called King Rama. So there are major influences beyond India, as I discovered.
Well, can you just remind people? I mean, people might have heard of Rama and know bits of the story, but I mean, it is in a sense quite an old-fashioned story of good versus evil. But the basic plot line is quite simple.
The basic plot line, which is very simple and basic, a bit like the Aeneid, I guess, is Rama, grows up, is a kind of warrior. Marries Sita, the wonderful, beautiful Sita, and he's, the golden couple. But then Rama is exiled because of one of his 3 mums. And he goes into a forest, and whilst him and Sita are in the forest, Sita is abducted by the demon Ravana, and Rama has to go into battle to win her back. Simple story. But then obviously there's
quite a lot of twists and turns and monkey armies and...
I didn't mention the bears and the monkeys.
Thank you for downloading this edition of Radio 4's Start the Week, presented by me, Stephanie Flanders. Hello and welcome to Start the Week. Today we're all about reimagining. One way or another, all of my guests have gone back into history to turn something old into something very new. Henrik Ibsen's play Ghosts is not that old. It was written in 1881. But for his new production at the Almeida, Richard Eyre says he had to work hard to square the circle of being close to what Ibsen intended while seeming spontaneous to an audience of today. Spontaneous or not, this brief, morbid tale still has the capacity to take the audience by the throat. There's a very different kind of reimagining in Red Dock, the latest work by the Canadian writer Anne Carson. In Greek mythology, the winged monster Geryon only has a bit part in the 10th labour of Hercules, but for Carson that's been enough to inspire not just one poetic novel, but now a remarkable sequel. And the notion of a hidden Celtic map of Europe, fashioned by Druids, also takes a bit of imagining, but Graham Robb insists he's not making it up, and his ancient paths prove that the Celts were a lot cleverer than we might think. But first, a modern retelling of Ramayana from Daljit Nagra. Now, Daljit, it's one of the great Hindu epics that's told and retold. It's several thousand years old, and it's not just an Indian story. I mean, it's spread and mutated across Asia.
Slightly witty, jokey way to his brother because he loves his brother and he's prepared to die for him. I found that a really moving episode, and also I don't think it's a very one-dimensional story because when we think of someone like Ravana or Rama. When I started reading around the tradition of it, and in South India, Ravana is seen as a hero. He's a modern-day hero. And in the north, Ravana is presented as a demon. It's black and white. But I mean, part of that is because the south is Dravidian, and the north is Aryan. And for many Southerners, there's this conflict that the north oppresses the south. So Rama and his hierarchical, monarchical structure is a kind of imposition not to be endured, Stephanie.
And I think you'll respond to it. Reading it now from modern culture, I mean, it sort of would tell you something about the culture you're reading it from, the way you react. I'm not sure if we should reveal, but there's a Sita, the wife, is not necessarily treated brilliantly towards the end, and I think people might react to that in different ways depending on where they come from. I mean, you're born in Britain. You're a secular global writer. I mean, was it particularly important for you, or did this story actually seem less significant to you or more?
I grew up with it. I'm from a Sikh background, and some of the Ramayana is in the Adi Granth, the Holy Sikh book. And the 10th Guru wrote his own version based on Valmiki, the northern version. And he was writing his version at a time when the Sikh